Hello, Good Shepherd history students. We are finishing our last lecture on U.S. history for the school year. We're going to finish up with World War I in section 23.4 today. You're going to get this in your packet on April 27th, whatever that Monday is, and it will not be due for 2 weeks. So I'm kind of staggering the work a little bit, but I know that by May 11th, which is a Monday, you should have all of your work for me turned in and done. And then on May 11th, I will send a history test for chapter 23 through Google Classroom. That will be a really easy way for you to just complete it, send it back to me. So that is the plan, and we would just finish up with that. I don't think we'll have time to do anything else. You have to admit we've gone really slowly in history. If we had been in regular class, we probably would have covered probably at least through the Great Depression, maybe World War II. I mean, that was my goal, but that's okay. I mean, we've done the best that we can. Distance learning with history is not the easiest thing. I know some of you have said it's hard sometimes to understand these concepts without a teacher there to ask questions of, but anyway, I think you're going to really enjoy this section because in this section we're going to talk about the last big epidemic to hit the world, which was the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919, so about 100 years ago and right as World War I was ending. So let's get started. All right, first of all, we talked in our last lecture about the end of World War I and how finally with the fresh infusion of American troops, the Allied side was able to win against the Germans. The Germans were starving. They were running out of young men to send to the front to fight. The Russians had bowed out. And so even though those German troops were able to rush westward and join with their other troops, there just wasn't enough of them, and they had taken such heavy losses. So they signed an armistice November 11th at 11 o'clock, and that is also when we celebrate Veterans Day because of that specific date, and the war finally ended. However, after a war is over, there is a great deal of damage and fallout that has to be taken care of. And so we're going to look at what the peace process looked like, and what were some of the problems facing those European nations that had had war ravaged on their land and against their people. Okay, so we look at the very first slide and we see a picture of some soldiers burying a person. We can see a person wrapped in a white cloth. In the background of the soldiers, I don't know if you can see very well, but there's rows and rows of kind of simple crosses. Those were the graveyards for the dead of World War I. Now, if you look at the bottom picture, the colored picture, you can see what they would look like today. You can still go and visit them. Because, of course, during those days and times, they really could not make much of an effort to return war dead back to their families, wherever they were from. So most people were buried right near where they died on the battlefield. I've heard many people say they've gone to these battlefields, and they're very, very moving. I think any kind of place like that, if you remember Arlington Cemetery, those 8th graders that went on that trip will remember that. It is a very solemn and weighty sort of feeling to be in a place where so many people gave up their life for their country. So although everyone was glad that the war was over, the tragedy and the loss was on everyone's thoughts still. It was not going to go away very easily. And for many, even though there was joy at the war being over, it also meant time to bury the dead. And that was a very, a kind of job that you might have in the military that people don't really talk about very much. But that was a job that some people in the military had, which was to bury bodies and to mark them and make sure that they kept track of who was buried where. Let's look at some of the tallies of the destruction of both people and property that occurred in World War I. First of all, the number of soldiers killed in World War I was far, far beyond anything the world had ever seen in a battle or in a war before. Keep in mind, we have at this point 6,000 years of history, many, many long battles over many years, but nothing to compare to this. And the largest reason was the type of warfare they used, that trench warfare, and the types of weapons that they used were not in sync with one another. You cannot fight close-up battles running at your enemy when your enemy has machine guns. It's going to cause huge amounts of death and destruction. So we look at the numbers and we can see that between the two sides, the Allied side, which was France, England, Belgium, some other smaller countries, Italy, and eventually the United States, 5 million soldiers lost, 5 million young men mainly. And the Central Powers, which was mainly Germany, Allied soldiers would have included Russia, even though they didn't finish the war, but the time that they did serve. And then the Central Powers, which was mainly Germany, Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, that side lost 3.5 million. So between the two sides, almost 9 million soldiers dead. That's a huge amount of people. It's even hard to wrap our heads around that. And besides that, 20 million more were wounded, and some of them very severely. They lost their limbs, or they were burned terribly, or they were gassed in some way so that they were blind, or had other kinds of disabilities for the rest of their lives. Particularly in the countries of Germany, France, and England, almost an entire generation of young men had been wiped out. We talked about Germany not having enough young men to even send to fight towards the end of the war. That was because they had all been killed. And so this was a very big problem going forward. Think about being a young woman at that time and wanting to get married and have a family and someone to support you. There weren't a lot of young men alive still to keep the country going. The U.S. lost, even though their involvement in the war was just a little over a year, 116,000 troops. So this is not a small amount of soldiers. So that was also a loss for us, and that's why you still will see World War I memorials in the United States, a lot of times in towns around the city hall. Financially, there was a huge hit, mainly in Europe, in the areas where the battles were fought and where those trenches were dug. Factories and farms and cities had been ruined by bombings. There was a severe food shortage because farmers, many of whom could not get in the fields or their fields had been destroyed. So the food shortage was a huge problem. And now, even though the war's over, their fields, I mean, if you look at the bottom picture, if that used to be your pasture or your wheat field, I mean, that's not going to be easily able to be turned into farmland again. The land is probably somewhat poisoned with chemicals and bombs and junk and trash and barbed wire everywhere. It's going to take a while before they can really use that land again. They estimate that about $30 billion, which is a huge sum for that time, worth of property was destroyed. And many countries from both sides had borrowed money in order to pay to fight the war. And now not only do they have to fix their country, fix their cities, fix their infrastructure, things like roads and railroad tracks, but they have some really huge debts that they owe for the fighting of the war. And many of them had borrowed money from American banks. So that's who they owe. Right at the end of the war, all of this is going to sound kind of familiar to you. In 1918, a worldwide epidemic, we can call that a pandemic, began of influenza, which we can call the flu. That's the shortened version for that word. This particular version of flu was a novel flu. In other words, it was a new type of flu. And so nobody had any immunity to it. If they got it, it wasn't like, oh, I've had that in the past, so my body has antibodies to fight it off. So it was extremely deadly and extremely contagious. Around the world, it killed around 30 million people, which was more people that died in World War I, in the entire war. So that gives you some scope of the amount of lost lives during this couple of years period. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. The epidemic was started in an Army training camp in Kansas, Fort Riley, And then the soldiers there that were training often went to other military camps to do further training, and that's one of the ways it was spread. And then others were shipped to Europe to go fight, and that was another way that it was spread. So it was called the Spanish flu at the time because initially they thought the flu started in Spain, but they later found that out to not to be true. But the name Spanish flu did stick with it, and you still hear it called that, the Spanish flu epidemic. But it really didn't start in Spain. It started in the United States. So many cities took measures to stop the spread of disease. They did things like quarantining, encouraging people to stay home from events, banning public gatherings, shutting down schools and businesses. These were just a few of the things they did that are similar to what we've been going through with COVID-19 today. Eventually, about a year later, it kind of ran its course. Once enough people got it, of course, many people died from it, but some people didn't, and they were able to build up immunity. So now this strain of the Spanish flu, it's still around, but it doesn't kill people because we have built up an immunity to it in our system. So that is a side that we can look at with this COVID-19 too. Even if COVID-19 doesn't go away, over time, people will build up an immunity to it and an ability to fight it off. When we look at the 30 million that died, about 800,000 of them were Americans. I like to point out that if you look at the little newspaper report there, you can read kind of what the headlines were, and also saying they're banning funerals, they're banning church services, they're shutting down gatherings and businesses. It just sounds really familiar. We can really relate to this. And so in a way, that's an encouragement to know that people in the past went through these things. They were difficult, but we can get through them too. And of course we can, especially with God's help. So President Woodrow Wilson, was president during this time still, and he was already, before the war ended, realizing that the Allies would win, and he was already thinking about a way to create a peace agreement after the war that would hopefully stop a similar type of war from starting again. So he already on his own began to outline his vision of what kind of peace treaty should we make to prevent a second world war. And what he came up with and what he introduced after the war was over was known as Wilson's 14 points. And that's sort of obviously because his peace proposal contained 14 different areas that he thought were important to address. We're not going to talk about all 14, but we're going to talk about a couple of them that were probably the most important. First of all, Wilson believed in self-determination for countries. He felt that countries should have the right to choose their own political status. In other words, if they wanted to be democratic, that's fine. If they wanted to be independent, then they should be allowed the chance to do that. So if we remember, before World War I, there were a lot of problems with different peoples living under other countries' rule and not liking that and feeling like I want to be part of this other country that shares my same languages and beliefs. And so Wilson was kind of looking at this and saying, you know, let's let the people have some choices about who they join in with. So some of the ideas that he proposed in his 14 points. Letter A, he said, you know, wherever there's a border dispute between countries, we need to work on settling that in a peaceful manner and in a way that we compromise with one another so that everybody doesn't get what they want, but everybody has to give a little bit and get a little bit so that everyone can be somewhat happy, and that will avoid future conflicts where one country won't come back later and say, oh, wait a minute, though, that was unfair. You got that section of land, and now we're going to have a war to get it back. Letter B, he said the military, which of course they've been spending lots and lots of money on making a big priority because they've been fighting a war. The military, he says, needs to be cut back in its funding. It needs to become smaller. If everyone has a small military, we won't be so quick to rush into another war. Letter C, Woodrow Wilson says, let's lower tariffs. Now, tariffs, remember, are those special taxes that you charge to other countries when they ship their goods to you, when they import goods to you. And so Woodrow Wilson is saying, let's lower those so that we can help trade to get started more quickly and more easily. Let's not make things more complicated by charging lots of taxes to these, or tariffs to these other countries, so that they don't want to trade with each other. We want trade to increase and to get going again after the war. D, he wanted to ban these secret treaties between nations. And if you remember, these kinds of treaties, these secret agreements, were one of the big reasons why World War I started, where one group or one nation agreed to help another nation if somebody attacked them, and pretty soon we have people joining up into two sides, and now we have a world war that killed millions of people. So that was something he said we want to make sure does not happen again. And letter E, he says some of these colonies that we have all over the world, that people, these imperialistic countries had, created an empire. If they want to be independent, let's start to work towards allowing them to be a free country. If you look at the picture there, Woodrow Wilson is offering a branch that says League of Nations. It's supposed to be like a peace branch, a branch of peace. He's offering to a dove, which is a symbol of peace. However, we would say that branch is way too large and heavy for the dove to handle. And the reason why is because maybe the cartoonist, I'm not positive here, was trying to say what Woodrow Wilson was asking for was maybe too much for what the other nations could stomach. The last point of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was his idea to create an international governing group that different nations would belong to, called the League of Nations. He thought that forming a group like this would be great, because every country would have a membership in it, and then if they had problems with each other and disputes about borders and arguments about colonies and whether a group of people wants to be governed by another group of people, then they can talk about that and they can avoid a war rather than just rushing to fight about it. And that was the whole point of the League of Nations. We're going to see what happens with that. We would say we have a similar group today called the United Nations, which I'm sure you've hopefully heard of. But this was kind of the precursor to that, the first idea of that. The nations of Europe looked at Wilson's 14 points, and they just didn't agree with them. We can say that Woodrow Wilson was pretty forward thinking for his time. So a lot of the things that he was saying he was a little ahead of his time. And the rest of the European nations, the winners especially, France, Belgium, England, Italy, they wanted to punish Germany. They saw Germany as causing the war. They saw Germany as causing the war, and they felt that they should be punished for that and take responsibility for that. And they wanted to make sure that the punishment for Germany was strong enough that Germany would suffer enough that they would never be a strong country again in any way. So the nations that were involved in World War I were meeting in Paris, outside Paris, in the Palace of Versailles. It's not Versailles, that's what it looks like, but in French you say Versailles. And this was a palace that had been built many years before by one of the French kings. France at this time no longer has a royalty, but they decide to meet at this palace in order to work out the peace details. So Woodrow Wilson traveled from the United States to Paris to meet with the other leaders. And the four main leaders, they were known as the Big Four, were the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, the French President, Georges Clemenceau, the Italian Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando, and then, of course, Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. President. And they kind of were the main people that took control of the peace conference and made all of the decisions about what would happen to the Germans and what would happen to all the disputed land and all of the other problems that they had to clear up. So the other Big Four leaders, not Wilson, because he still wanted his 14 points, which were much more relaxed and were not trying to punish Germany. The other leaders wanted to punish Germany. They want, number one, that Germany should accept all of the blame for starting the war, which wasn't fair because it wasn't just Germany starting the war. It was lots of countries jumping into the war. The second thing is they want Germany to pay reparations. Now, reparations is just a fancy word for saying you have to pay for the damages that you caused because of this war. The war, when they looked at all of the damages, $33 billion, was not something that Germany had. They did not have that kind of money. They were in a terrible state. People in their country were starving. So putting this kind of very severe punishment on Germany was going to cause a lot of hardship for that country, which of course the other leaders, the big four leaders, knew, and that they wanted to do that. But unfortunately, that caused a lot of anger and resentment from the German people, and it made them ripe for a leader like Adolf Hitler, who's going to come along and promise to make Germany great again after many years of suffering. These reparations are going to cause a great deal of suffering in Germany. And lastly, the other big four leaders said some of this German territory is disputed. Some of it, France is saying, oh, that used to be French land and we want it back. So they took some of that German territory that had been German for quite a long time and gave it back to specifically France, maybe a little bit to Belgium too. I'm not sure about that. So in addition, some good things came out of the Treaty of Versailles, which is what this peace treaty is going to be known as. Some new independent countries were created out of what used to be Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, and then the country of Finland are created. Poland is restored to its rightful boundaries, and they did decide to create that 14th point of Woodrow Wilson's. They did create the League of Nations that he had hoped for. If you look at the political cartoon on the bottom of the slide, we can see that Germany is underneath this huge money bag that says $55 billion, or maybe it says 35, I don't know. No, it looks like 55. So again, buried, crushed, suffocated. That's what this peace treaty was going to do to Germany, and make them suffer in a way that was not helpful towards creating a sense of peace and well-being in Europe. Okay, this is our last slide. So President Woodrow Wilson comes back to the United States. He needs to take this Treaty of Versailles and have it ratified by the United States Congress. The United States House of Representatives votes to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. But Woodrow Wilson knows he will have trouble getting the 2/3 majority of the U.S. Senate to pass it. So Wilson was a Democrat, and he knew that the Republicans in the Senate would be very hard to convince, that they were not going to like some of the things in the Treaty of Versailles. In particular, the Republicans did not like the formation of the League of Nations, and the reason that they did not like the League of Nations was part of being the League of Nations meant that if the League of Nations was fighting some sort of a battle and they needed military troops, the U.S. might have to also contribute troops to something that the League of Nations was doing. And the Republican senators, and their leader was Henry Cabot Lodge, there's a picture of him on the top left, opposed that idea. They said the U.S. should not have to send troops to go work for the League of Nations. They should not have to send United States troops to do that. However, Henry Cabot Lodge really hated Woodrow Wilson. They had a very difficult relationship, and many people felt that Henry Cabot Lodge, as a leader in the Senate, really, a lot of this was personal for him, and he did not want to see the League of Nations come to be because he knew that Woodrow Wilson especially wanted that. That was his creation. So Woodrow Wilson began traveling the country, trying to get support, similarly to the way they did before they entered World War I, trying to get support for people to pressure their senators to vote to join the League of Nations and to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. While he was traveling around, he was probably under a great deal of stress, and he was getting older, and he had a stroke. And really, for the remainder of his time after he had that stroke as president, he was very ill and pretty ineffective as a president. So that kind of ended his bid for trying to convince the public to vote for it. Ultimately, the Treaty of Versailles was not passed in the Senate. It was defeated. And so the U.S. did not sign the Treaty of Versailles and had to sign separate peace agreements with the different Central Power nations. And the U.S. did not join the League of Nations, which was very, very disappointing, extremely disappointing for Woodrow Wilson, who had planned that. If you look at the bottom political cartoon, we have, again, a bird of peace. He has the League of Nations sitting under him on the end of the bed. He's supposed to be representative of this idea that we want to move forward peacefully. The senator is the guy in the bed who looks scared, and he's covered up. And he's saying to the bird, "See that horrible vulture, take it away, take it away." So giving the idea that the senators don't see the League of Nations as a peaceful thing. They see it as something that is gross and disgusting, and they don't want anything to do with it. So unfortunately, the Treaty of Versailles was not a particularly great treaty in the way that it treated Germany. It set up the countries of Europe to enter the Second World War, another couple of decades later. And then also it symbolized the kind of the end of Woodrow Wilson's say and power in the United States. And unfortunately, we did not get involved in that League of Nations, and that also is going to be not helpful with the way history in Europe is going to go. All right, so that is the end of the slides for that. Like I said, please take notes over this, and you will see a test coming around May 11th through Google Classroom, and then you can take that and return to me, and that will be our last little bit for history for this school year. Take care and have a great week.